freedom is a subjective lawlessness. One does not know according to which rule to judge one's own or other people's actions. Fancies, strange taste, evil or empty vagaries can bring about effects which one wasn't prepared for. It confuses, therefore. All of nature, if it doesn't submit itself to objective rules, which however cannot be anything else but the general conditions of the attunement with nature itself, is bogged into confusion by this. Wherefore man without moral laws becomes despicable even beneath beasts, and more hateable than them. Who doesn't operate according to objective laws must be compelled according to physical ones. Immanuel Kant. I have talked for several months now on this channel about Kant's moral philosophy. But I have so far mainly focused on Kant's ethics. And that means that so far I have excluded one important large part of his moral philosophy, that is his philosophy of right. And this is what I want to focus on now in the upcoming lectures of the next weeks, the next months, surely well into the next year. And I want to start this topic by first discussing what even is the philosophy of right to Kant. So what constitutes right and what is the distinction between right and ethics. Let me start by first explaining to you or reminding you where we are within Kant's system. Because to Kant, it is very important to always be architectonic in science. I have discussed that in its own lecture on his architectonic method. Indeed, Kant would say that this is the architectonic. This is what makes science. Cognition is not scientific because of its specific content. It is not so much scientific either because of the methods through which you arrived at this cognition. Rather, what makes it scientific is its relationship to other cognitions. In science, the cognitions are not like the grains in a pile of sand, but they are like the parts of an organic body. Science makes up an architectonic system. And this is something I discussed in my lecture on what is science to Kant. And within his system, he says that philosophy, or rather the material philosophy, because to him there's also formal philosophy, that is logic, dealing only with the formal laws of thinking, independent of the specific content of our thinking. But the material philosophy has two parts. There is theoretical and practical philosophy. And theoretical philosophy is the philosophy of nature. Practical philosophy is the philosophy of freedom. Both, being sciences, deal with laws, but with different kinds of laws. Theoretical philosophy deals with the laws of being. So it asks what is, what exists, and what laws govern that which exists. On the other hand, practical philosophy, since it deals with freedom, cannot talk about laws that necessarily do govern things, because then again we would be talking about nature, we would be talking about what is, not about freedom. It can only talk about laws that should govern us. So the laws of freedom are not the laws of being, rather they are the laws of duty, the laws of what ought to be. And that is mainly moral laws. So Those are the two types of philosophy in general, or of material philosophy. I discussed this further in my lecture, What is Philosophy to Kant? And then, and this too I have already discussed further, this time in my lecture, What is Metaphysics to Kant? Then Kant says every science has a pure and an applied part. The applied part, or the empirical part of the science, deals with something which we can only know a posteriori, that is, from experience. Applied theoretical philosophy would be natural science, because as theoretical philosophy, it deals with being and trying to find the laws of being. And as applied philosophy, it deals with what we experience. Well, what is it that exists and that we experience? It is nature. So applied theoretical philosophy deals with the laws of nature and is therefore natural science. On the other hand, applied practical philosophy, what that is a bit more complicated. In the stricted sense, there cannot be such a thing as applied practical philosophy, because, again, practical philosophy is about the laws of what should happen, of what ought to happen. And applied science is about experience, but experience can only tell us what is, not what ought to be. There is no experience of the ought. So in the stricter sense, there is no applied practical philosophy to Kant. However, you could say applied practical philosophy could be the philosophy of happiness. So teaching us what we should do in order to become happy. Because this would be about what to do with our freedom, what we should do, what we ought to do, but not what we ought to do in itself, what we morally ought to do, what our duty is, but what we ought to do in order to reach the goal of happiness. And that we have this goal of happiness, that we are creatures that desire happiness, that would be something we can only know from experience. Applied practical philosophy, however, could also mean what Kant calls moral anthropology. That would be dealing with what are human beings and how can they become moral, right? So not what is moral, what should we do. That belongs to pure practical philosophy. That we don't need experience to answer that. We just ask our reason. But from experience, we can tell what a human being is and what obstacles are there to the humanity of human beings, what desires, what drives do humans have that might them drive away from humanity, and what might be good ways to overcome them and to make sure that we don't succumb to our desires, but rather pursue a moral goal. So this could be considered applied practical philosophy also. But be that as it may, there is also, I said, a pure science always. And that is what Kant calls metaphysics. That is a science a priori, so a science that is not based on experience, but based on reason alone and what we can know from reason alone. And, well, the metaphysics of nature, so the metaphysics in theoretical philosophy, deals with being, with what exists, insofar as it is not known from experience, but from reason. So it mainly asks, is there a God? Is there free will? Is there an immortal soul? But what concerns us here is pure practical philosophy, or the metaphysics of morals. And this is moral philosophy to Kant. This is asking the question, what should we do with our freedom? What do we ought to do? But not in order to reach a goal like happiness that we only know of having from experience, but simply what do we ought to do, independently of any goals that we have or not. And what is our duty, in other words? And indeed, Kant calls this metaphysics of morals also the doctrine of duties. So we ask reason alone, what should happen? What should we do? And this moral philosophy in general, this metaphysics of morals, this doctrine of duties, this in turn, Kant says, has two parts, the ethics and the right. And before I go into what the distinction between those two is, I first, since I'm talking here in English and Kant is of course writing in German, I first want to give a note on the translation. Kant talks about Recht, or about Rechtslehre, doctrine of right, or teaching of right. And it seems the question how to translate that may seem rather straightforward, right? The word Recht in German and the word right in English seem to be the same. I mean, they do have the same Germanic root. So originally it is the same word. But the interesting thing with language is that not even translating is not even difficult when the language or their vocabulary are unrelated, come from different roots. But even two languages that have the same roots, using what seems to be one and the same word, can still use it in a different manner. So even here there can be some nuance that makes translation difficult. Because while originally right and recht is certainly the same word, there has been a kind of shift in how these words have been used, and so you cannot in all instances really translate one with the other. Because in German there are two meanings to the word Recht. One, we use it to talk about specific rights, just like in English. Like you have the right to live, you have the right to free speech, you have the right to property. Here too, in German, you would talk of a Recht. But then in German, the word right is also used in a more general sense, where in English you would use the word law. But I mean here law with a capital L. I mean law without an article. Because when you talk about specific laws, like the law that you mustn't kill anyone, or the law that you mustn't steal, or the law that you mustn't jaywalk, or also the laws of nature, like the law of gravity, or the law of survival of the fittest, or whatever. Here in German you would use the word Gesetz, so a completely different word that has nothing to do with the word Recht or right. But then in English you also sometimes talk not about a law, but you talk about law without using the article. For example, when someone says, I study law, right? You would not say I study the law, you would just say I study law. And you study law and then you become a lawyer. Well, in German, here we don't use our word for law. We don't say, ich studiere das Gesetz. We use the word Recht. We say, ich studiere Recht, or ich studiere Rechtswissenschaft, which just means the science of Recht. And what you become, so the German word for lawyer, is Rechtsanwalt. Anwalt just means advocate, so the right advocate. Or also in English, you may talk about law and order. Well, in German, we would not say Gesetz und Ordnung, we would say Recht und Ordnung. Or likewise, in English, you may speak of the rule of law. In German, when there's the rule of law in a given state, we call this state a Rechtsstaat. So the right state, the state of right. So you can see that in German this word Recht is used in the sense where in English this word law with capital L is used. I can only think, maybe a native speaker can think of more, but I can only think of one instance in the English language where you would use the word right in kind of this sense, and that is in the phrase by right. So, for example, this property is mine by right. But in general, in English, you use the word law, when in German you would speak of Recht. So, for that reason, what Kant calls Rechtslehre, and that's not just Kant, like the words Rechtslehre or Rechtsphilosophie, you can also find them with other philosophers like Fichte or like Hegel. Like this is a common term in German philosophy. What Kant calls Rechtslehre, you can translate as doctrine of right, but you could also translate it as doctrine of law. One reason I have not, because this is clearly what Kant means by Recht. He doesn't mean in this case like a specific right or teaching about all the rights there are, the sum of rights, but he means something more general. The reason why I have not translated it as the doctrine or the philosophy of law is that I don't really like this this way the English language expresses it, using the word law and not the word right. It seems a bit, let's say, positivistic or formalistic to me, because a law can be anything, right? A law can also be a bad law. It can be an unjust law, like the Nuremberg race laws of the Nazis that took away the equal rights of the Jews. They were basically apartheid laws, even though, of course, was not that name at the time. Or the Jim Crow laws in the US, they too were laws, just not good ones. So that's why I prefer the German word Rechtsstaat to the English rule of law. Because if we take the term rule of law literally, then under the Nazis or under apartheid in South Africa, there was also the rule of law, just the rule of a very unjust law, right? While in German, when you say Rechtsstaat, it's not just implied in the word that this is a state where there are laws, where things are not happening completely arbitrarily, but it is implied that the laws are right. It is implied that people have their proper rights here. And so, for that reason, I didn't like to translate Kant's term as philosophy or doctrine of law, because, of course, Kant does not want to talk about any possible laws there could be, but rather he wants to talk about rights, about the right laws. And this leads me to another aspect of the German word Recht that is lost in the English language. Because the German word for justice is Gerechtigkeit. Or if you want the adjective just, the word is gerecht. And this G denotes that it is in accordance with, right? So the word gerecht for just literally means something being in accordance with the right, or in accordance with what is right. And that is, of course, what something being just means, right? So there's clearly this connection between Gerechtigkeit, justice, and right. Indeed, sometimes the word Gerechtigkeit is shortened to the word Recht, and Recht is used in the same way as meaning justice. And for example, in German, when a judge pronounces his judgment, we say er spricht Recht. So literally, he speaks right, or he speaks justice, meaning he says what is right? He says what is just. He applies the rights. Of course, in English, there is absolutely zero connection between the word right and the word justice, because of the special history of the English language, being made up basically of two languages, right? The word right has a Germanic origin, while the word justice comes from the Latin root. And this is kind of an issue. This is something that, for example, Fichte in his philosophy of language discussed, not specifically about English, talking in more general terms, that it is detrimental for thinking, for philosophy, if a language is not something that grew organically, if the words have no specific meaning within the language, right? Like the word justice in the English language, you have to learn like you learn vocabulary. It has no inherent meaning. So if there was an English speaker who knew all the vocabulary there is in the English language except the words justice and just, and now he heard them for the first time, he still wouldn't know what they mean. He would have to first have it explained to him. While a German speaker who knows all the words of German, including the word Recht, and now were to hear the word Gerechtigkeit for the first time, could probably understand what it means. And clearly, Kant, when speaking of the philosophy, the Rechtsphilosophie, or the Rechtslehre, he has in mind a teaching of justice, or a doctrine of justice, or a philosophy of justice. And indeed, this would have been the third possibility of translating it. Kant has this habit of putting in brackets behind his important terms Latin translations. And indeed, the way he translates the German word Recht is with the Latin word jus, which is, of course, where justice comes from. And the term Rechtslehre he translates as doctrina justi. So for that reason, I think it would also be very valid to translate it as doctrine of justice. So this is what you should keep in mind, both in this lecture and in all the upcoming ones, that when I use the word right, I did choose to translate it like that. you could maybe also use the word law or the word justice in its place. And when I talk about the philosophy or the doctrine of right, you could also say the philosophy or doctrine of law or of justice. With this note on translation out of the way, what now is right as opposed to ethics? Well, once again, let me remind you that both of them belong to the metaphysics of morals to Kant. Both of them belong to what he calls the doctrine of duties. So both are about our duties, about what we should do. Now, Kant does say that a duty is something we don't necessarily want to do. We should do it, but maybe we don't like to do it. So, in fulfilling a duty, there is a need for compulsion. We need to somehow be compelled to do our duty. But here, there are two different possibilities. One is a person can compel himself to do something. And that is what happens in ethics. Here it is the rational human being, what Kant calls the homo noumenon, which compels the sensual human being, what Kant calls the homo phenomenon. This distinction is very important for his moral philosophy and not just for that. I have addressed it in several previous lectures. I would advise you specifically to go back to my lecture on the apperception, the self-consciousness, if you want it explained further. But basically, Kant would say in ethics, the sensual human being might not want to do what is good. The sensual human being might have certain desires, like maybe I'm hungry, so I want to steal that food there, or maybe I'm overcome with lust and I want to rape someone. But then the rational human being, so my own humanity, my own rationality, has a clear insight that this action would be wrong, and if I am a good person, compels the sensual part of me to not act on these sensual desires. But then Kant says it is also possible, of course, to be compelled not by yourself, but from the outside, right? Like that same person that wants to steal or wants to rape. Maybe he is not a good person, so maybe he would not stop himself out of the rational insight that this action would be evil, but he could probably be stopped from the outside, like by a state which has laws against stealing or against rape, and which threatens him with punishment. And so this would be a pathological compulsion. Because here the very same sensuality that might make me do an evil action makes me refrain from it, because that very same sensuality is threatened, right? I'm threatened with, let's say, prison, and I understand that this would not be pleasurable, and so I weigh the pleasure I might receive from my crime, like from stealing, with the displeasure I might receive from the punishment, and I consider the displeasure to be greater, and so committing the crime not worth it. And this is the distinction Kant makes. Both ethics and right are about duties, so about actions that we maybe don't like to do, but that we should do. But ethics deals with us compelling ourselves to do it, while the right deals with that, with those actions which we may be compelled to do by outside forces, by other human beings. Kant says there are certain moral duties that come with a right of compulsion that other humans have towards me. That's, of course, not the case for all moral duties. So, for example, there are duties towards myself. I discussed that in a specific lecture on that topic. Kant says morality is not just about how I treat others, it's also about how I treat myself. I have a duty to not throw my own humanity away, to not degrade myself. So, for example, it is immoral to succumb to drunkenness. I can maybe drink a glass of wine now and again, but I should not get drunk, because then I would give up my own rationality and my own humanity, therefore my own autonomy, and I would be degrading myself. Well, this is a moral duty I have, but here I must compel myself. I cannot be compelled by others. While it is immoral if I get drunk, another person still has no right to force me to not get drunk, to take the alcohol simply away from me, because by getting drunk, I am only acting immoral towards myself and not towards somebody else. So here there's no right of compulsion. But when it comes to murdering, raping, stealing, if I do this or try to do this, the other person has no duty to simply accept it, to simply let himself be victimized, but rather the other person has a right to defend himself, and that means to Kant a right of compulsion towards me. That is, the other person has a right to compel me to conform with my moral duties of letting him be, letting his property be, letting his body be. If I attack someone, if I try to murder someone or try to steal from someone, he is within his rights to use force, to use violence against me, like to disarm me, to drive me away, maybe even to kill me in self-defense if it really comes down to that. But he does have a right to, one way or another, force me to not harm his rights. Indeed, he doesn't just have that right, like it's not just a possibility, a right that he can make use of, but rather it is itself a moral duty, once again, one of the duties towards myself, to not let my rights be attacked, to not let injustice be done to me. So just like it would be against the duties towards myself, according to Kant, to commit suicide or to give myself willingly into another slavery, it would also be against the rights towards myself to let another person kill me or to let another person enslave me and to not resist at all. No, I must, if I have reverence for myself, for my own humanity, if I want to live with dignity, then I must defend my rights. And so I have not just a duty, I have not just a right, I even have a duty to compel someone to accept, to not harm my rights. However, Kant also stresses I have a right only of compulsion towards others. I don't have a right to punishment. So, if we imagine the state of nature, like a state where no state, no government, no laws exist, and now someone steals from me, I have the right to defend my property, to drive him away. Or if he does manage to steal from me, I have the right to go after him and to steal my property back. Or again, if someone attacks me trying to murder me, I have again the right to drive him off. I have a right to disarm him maybe and keep his weapons so that he cannot attack me anymore. Or maybe if that is my only way of protecting myself, I even have a right to kill him in self-defense. But I have no right, if I did save my life or my property, I have no right to additionally punish him for his actions. Like, if I did drive him away, I cannot now go after him to beat him up because he attacked me. Or if I do manage to get my stolen property back, I cannot now steal something from him, to teach him a lesson or something. The state, of course, if we leave the state of nature, if there is a state, a government, if there's laws, then the state takes my rights of compulsion. Now it is the state with its police that can defend me. And now, let's say someone steals from me, I myself now no longer have the right to break into his house and steal it back. But the state has that right for me, right? The state can send the police to his home and confiscate whatever he stole and give it back to me. And the state additionally also has the right to punish. But I myself only have this right of compulsion. If I myself went further, if I myself tried to punish someone, then I would no longer be protecting my freedom, my rights. Rather, I would now be attacking and infringing on his freedom, his rights, right? I would presume to be above him, to have a right to punish him, when actually we are both human beings and as such we are equals, right? This would not be an action of justice, because here the victim and the judge and the executor of the judgment would all be one person, right? No, punishment, Kant says, can only happen within the state, not in the state of nature. But we do, even in the state of nature, have this right of compulsion. And it is this right of compulsion through which Kant defines his term of right as opposed to ethics. And if the right is defined as including all those duties to whose fulfillment we might be compelled by others, then this automatically means that a lot of moral duties are excluded from the philosophy of right. The moral duties as such fall under 4 groups or categories according to Kant, and this I discussed in previous lectures. Because to Kant there are the duties towards myself and the duties towards others, both of which I discussed in their own lecture. And then there are the perfect and the imperfect duties, or the narrow and the wider duties. So there are narrow duties towards myself and wider duties towards myself, and there are narrow duties towards others and wider duties towards others. Of these, all the duties towards myself are simply ethical duties, or duties of virtue, as Kant calls ethics also the doctrine of virtues. So I will fulfill these duties, I will compel myself to fulfill these duties if I'm a virtuous, if I'm a good, ethically good person. But I mustn't be compelled to fulfill them by others. The duties towards myself, as I discussed in previous lectures, are about my own humanity, my own dignity as a human being, and ultimately they are about my freedom, my autonomy. The narrow duties towards myself are about not harming, not taking away my own freedom, right? Like by committing suicide or by getting drunk or addicted to any drugs, I destroy my own freedom. And the wider duties towards myself are about expanding my freedom, about more and more realizing my humanity, becoming a more capable, more educated, more fully realized human being. So I may have a duty to learn new skills, to further educate myself, and so on. It is clear that both not taking away my freedom and actually even expanding my freedom is something that others have no right to compel me to. Right? No one can force me to not get drunk. No one can force me to learn a new skill. This would be an attack of my freedom. And this would therefore, if they did force me, then they would be in breach of their own duties towards others. And this is an important remark. Maybe it sounds rather self-evident or rather trivial if put in this general manner. But if you actually apply it to real laws that did exist in the past or that still exists in other parts of the world, or maybe that still exist in this part of the world, then you will find that indeed there have been or there are many laws that try to force people not to fulfill their duties towards others, but to fulfill their duties, their actual or maybe their just presumed duties towards themselves. And this is not right. This is despotic. So take drug laws. Again, yes, it is immoral, Kant would say. It is a self-degradation if I get on drugs. Like if I get drunk, for example. But still, others cannot compel me not to do this. They can maybe try to help me. They can maybe tell me not to do it, try to convince me, but they mustn't simply force me. So that would mean that not only can the state not forbid alcohol or smoking, but also all kinds of other drugs. And I'm not just talking about something like weed, but even something like heroin. The state has no right to prohibit this as such. Of course, if it leads to me possibly attacking the rights of others, that's a different story, right? Like there can be a prohibition, for example, of drunk driving, because drunk driving is dangerous for others. But if I get drunk within my own home, this has no direct influence on anyone else. And the same is true if I get stoned or if I get high in some other manner in my own home. I am here not attacking others' rights, not attacking others' freedom. And so no one can, by right, compel me not to do this. And likewise, consider sexual laws. So you may believe that certain sexual acts are immoral. that they are breaches of your duties towards yourself, that you are degrading your own humanity if you engage in these sex acts. You may believe, for example, that homosexual acts are immoral, or you may believe that sex outside of marriage is immoral. And indeed, these are two things that Kant did believe. I would say this is one of the instances where Kant is lacking when it comes to the application of his own philosophy. I've said this before, that Kant is often great when it comes to the principles, and here he was a very critical and very radical thinker, going beyond the philosophy of his time. But then when it comes to applying the principles, he often arrives at the very same beliefs, the very same judgments that were common in his time in the 18th century. Like in this case, you mustn't be gay, or you mustn't have sex outside marriage, which I believe, if he had been even more critical, if he really had thought his own new principles through, he might have found that many of these judgments are just prejudices of his age. But Kant, the philosopher, is greater than Kant, the person. So we are free, I would say, to apply Kant's philosophy more critically and more thoroughly than he himself might have done. But be that as it may, my point is that even if you do believe that these acts are immoral and that people should not do them, you still should at the same time believe that these acts mustn't be forbidden. And indeed, Kant says as much, not about homosexuality, where he doesn't discuss it, but he says that prostituting yourself, of course, I'm not talking about forced prostitution. That is, of course, something the state should forbid, because here someone is taking someone else's freedom away. But Kant says that prostituting yourself, or that having sex outside marriage, is degrading your own humanity, is therefore something that a virtuous person would not do, but is something that is not unjust. That is, you are not harming anyone else's rights, and therefore it should not be forbidden and it should not be punished. Because again, the state is not there to punish when you aren't acting in an ethical manner, right? For the same reason, the state should not punish lies. Maybe lies in certain contexts, to be sure, like when you commit fraud, when you because this is basically stealing through a lie, but not any lies in daily life as such, right? These might be immoral, but they are no concern of the state, because no one's rights are really harmed. And besides, in addition to that, Kant says that at least in some cases it would not even possible to compel people to fulfill the duties towards themselves. Like, there are some duties towards yourself that you could be compelled to, even though others have no right to compel you. But there are some where it would simply absurd to even try to compel you. Like, for example, as I said, we mustn't commit suicide, Kant says. But he also makes fun of the notion that suicide should be forbidden in a given state, that there should be laws against suicide. And basically Kant says, how would you punish someone for trying to commit suicide? Would you deal out the death penalty? That's not really a threat to someone who wants to die, right? So you basically have nothing to threaten him with. And also, I want to add to what Kant says, that not only must the state with its laws not compel you to act in an ethical manner to fulfill your ethical duties. It also must not compel you to fulfill religious duties. Here we can stick to sexual laws. Again, you may believe that sex outside marriage or homosexual sex is not just immoral, but that it is sinful. But even if you believe that, you should not support it being forbidden in a given state. Because, I mean, let's say you're right. Let's say homosexuality is a sin. So that's the gay person's problem, not yours, right? Let God punish it. One day that gay person may die, and if you're right, then God will throw him into hell for what he did. But as long as that person is not forcing you to also engage in gay intercourse, his actions are his own problem, and not really attacking any of your rights. And so you have no right to compel that person to not commit sins. Besides, I mean, for whom are you even doing this? Clearly not for yourself, because again, you are not compelled by the other person to take part in his sins, so it's not your problem if he sins. But you are also not doing it for him, because if you believe that God is all-knowing, then God clearly will judge the hearts and not the actions. So, I mean, let's say being gay really was a sin. Do you really think that in that case you're saving someone from hell by just forcing him to not have gay sex? I mean, if he would have done it without you forcing him, then God will probably still punish him, right? Because God will know what he would have done. So this is against the right, and it is clearly also just an absurd action that even within the framework of your own beliefs, if you have such beliefs, doesn't really make any sense. But anyways, so the duties towards myself, both narrow and wider duties, are duties where others have no right of compulsion towards me. Now, the duties towards others, the wider duties towards others, are about supporting others' purposes. I discussed that in the previous lecture. Kant would say they are about happiness, about furthering others' happiness. I think here Kant is being inconsistent, and I would go with Fichte and say they too are about freedom, about expanding, in this case, not your own, but others' freedom. But in either case, whether you say their principle is happiness or freedom, here too there is no right of compulsion. Because if you're not helping somebody else, well, you're simply not helping. Maybe that makes you an asshole, but it doesn't make you unjust. It doesn't mean that you are actively harming that person's right. So that leaves only the fourth group, the narrow duties towards others, which are duties to have reverence for others' rights. They are duties just like the narrow duties towards yourself are about not taking your own freedom away. These duties are about not taking the other's freedom away, right? By stealing from him, attacking him, raping him, murdering him. And here, these are the duties where the other has a right of compulsion. So, take a beggar, for example. If somebody passes the beggar without giving him money, then that person may not have done his wider duty towards others. He may not have furthered the other person's purpose. And it means maybe he hasn't acted virtuously. He hasn't acted in an ethical manner. And the beggar could maybe rightfully complain about that, could maybe rightfully say, oh, you have a hard heart, you see me here begging, being so poor, being close to starving, and you have no compassion for me, you just keep walking by, that is evil of you. But still, the beggar has no right to force me to give him money, right? The beggar, that would be stealing my money. But if, on the other hand, I don't just pass by the beggar without giving him something, but rather I steal the little money that others have given to him, now here the beggar would have a right to prevent this. To, if I try to grab the cup with his money, to hold on to the cup and to again tear it away from me. Because here I would not just not further the purposes of that beggar, but rather I would be attacking his right to his property, to what was given to him. And in that case, and in that case alone, he would have this right of compulsion, Kant says. So of the four types of moral duties, narrow and wide duties towards myself, narrow and wide duties towards others, all four are ethical duties or duties of virtue, but only one type, only the narrow duties towards others, are also legal duties, are also duties of right. They are also still at the same time ethical duties. So, for example, to not kill other people is of course both ethical. If you are a virtuous person, you won't do it. And it is also a legal duty, right? You can also, by rights, be compelled by other people or by the state not to kill others. But even when it comes to this type of moral duties, to the narrow duties towards others, they are both ethical and legal, so the content is the same, but they are so in a different manner. Kant calls at some point ethics the philosophy of attitude, and the right he calls the philosophy of law, because ethics is concerned with, well, your attitude, your mindset, your ethos, while right is only concerned with the law itself, with the letter of the law, and whether you conform to it or not. Because, and I discussed this in my previous lecture on the good will and the good deeds, to Kant, in ethics, what matters is not simply our actions, what matters is our will. Kant says it is only the good will that is truly good. Of course, the good will lead to good actions, but Kant says ethic doesn't just demand that you do a specific action that is good. If you do that, then you have acted in accordance with your duty. But ethics also demands that you act out of duty. To Kant, as I explained in that previous lecture, there's a difference between the morality and the legality of an action. So I used the example of someone drowning in a lake or in a river, and you pulling him out. You have now, your action has legality, that is, it is in accordance with the moral law and with your moral duty. You have done what you should do. But that leaves open the question of your morality. That depends on your will. That is, It depends on the reason why you did this action. Because maybe you really did it out of reverence for the drowning person's humanity. Maybe you really did it simply because it was the right thing to do. Then you are a good, a virtuous person. But maybe you also did it because you simply wanted people to think of you as a hero. Or maybe you knew the drowning person was rich and you were hoping for him to be thankful and to reward you. Or maybe you were afraid of being punished for not helping. In case there are laws, I don't know about your country, but here in Germany there are laws that you actually must help people in danger if you can. And otherwise you can be punished. So there's a difference, but this difference matters only for ethics, because once again, right is defined as being about those duties to whose fulfillment we can be compelled. But it should be evident that all compulsion is an outer compulsion. It is physical. That means we can be compelled to do certain actions, but we cannot possibly be compelled by other people, by force, by threat of punishment, to have a certain attitude, to have a certain goodwill. So, for example, the state can maybe prevent me from killing someone by threatening me with punishment, be it prison or be it execution or whatever. But the state cannot compel me to not want to kill someone. That is, it cannot compel me to have a good will, to have reverence for that other person's humanity. Maybe I still hate that other person. Maybe I still would kill him first chance I get. Maybe I would still be very happy about his death. And it's just the threat of punishment, of prison, that keeps me from it. But for the state, that is good enough, right? The state doesn't care about my will. It doesn't care whether I fulfill its laws because I'm a good person or simply because I want to avoid punishment. It only cares about me fulfilling its laws. So, for that reason, once again, ethics is about my inner attitude. It is about my goodwill, which of course will manifest in outer actions, but ethics is not about these actions as such. While right, since it is about only that which I can be compelled to, is only about my actions, not about the morality of my will, but about the legality of my actions. This is why the state cannot and should not punish anyone for being a bad person, for being an asshole. This is why, for example, you cannot forbid racism, right? You can forbid certain actions that may come from racism. Like, of course, the state can and should prevent people from attacking immigrants or minorities or people of a different skin color. The state should prevent people setting fire to refugee camps. The state may also prevent hate speech because this may incite certain kinds of violence. But if you are just racist in your heart, if you just happen to believe that other people are subhuman and worth less than you, then maybe God, who knows the human hearts, may punish you for that, but the state may not. So, for this reason, you could also define ethics and right as the former being about the will and the latter being about choice. These two faculties I discussed in my lecture on the faculty of desiring, because Kant says the human faculty of desiring has these two parts, will and choice. And by choice, he means what we would probably often call will in usual daily language. Choice to him is that faculty that chooses specific actions. May I do A or may I do B? Will I go through this door or through that door? Will I eat the apple or will I eat the banana? So choice is what chooses specific actions. Will, on the other hand, chooses not a specific action, but the mode or the principle of all our actions. So, for example, if I have a good will, then I choose to generally act according to the moral law. Then I decide to generally act according to the moral law. But I may also, of course, decide, if I don't have a good will, to generally act out of self-interest. Now, in a specific given situation, I may now choose a certain action. Like I may choose to help someone, or I may choose to harm someone. And that choice may be determined by my will. So if my will is to be good, then in this situation I probably choose to help that person. And if my will is to seek my self-interest, then in this situation I may choose to not help that person. Or maybe because it somehow does serve my self-interest, I may also choose to help that person, right? So once again, the same choice to do a legal action, to do an action in accordance with my moral duties, may in one instance be done out of a good will, and in one instance it may not be. So if you think of these two faculties that Kant describes, then you could say ethics deals with the will, and therefore with that which, so to say, is inside of us, with that which is supersensual, which only God can truly know, while right deals only with our choice, and therefore with the actual actions we choose to do or not to do, no matter why we choose to do that. Again, that is not a concern to the state. So you can say that materially, that is, by the content of the duties, ethics and right are identical. I mean, at least in the field of the narrow duties towards others. Ethics also encompasses the three other types of duties, but when we just consider this one type of duty, then materially ethics and rights are identical. They both say this same thing should be done by me, or this same thing should not be done by me. But formally they are different, because the right just says this you should do or this you shouldn't do, like you shouldn't kill, while ethics says you should want to do this, or you should want to not do this. You shouldn't kill because you shouldn't want to kill, because you should understand that killing is wrong. And this distinction, this is also why Kant says when it comes to right, there is no difference between the spirit and the letter of the law. Otherwise, this distinction is important to Kant, and I discussed that in previous lectures, that Kant would say there's always the letter of the law. So what the law literally says. But when it comes to ethics, there is a spirit to the law, like what the law really means. And what matters is us following that spirit, not the letter, right? So, for example, in ethics, you can say, okay, the moral law says it is immoral to lie. Well, in German, the usual way of starting a letter is sehr geehrter Herr or sehr geehrte Frau, which means very honored sir or very honored madam. Just like in English, you may start with dear. And by the mere letter of the law, this might often be a lie. You might write this to someone whom you don't honor very much, or you might write this to someone who's not dear to you. But if we go by the spirit of the law, what the law is really about is not tricking others, not leading others astray, not creating illusions. And here Kant would say, what we are saying when we are writing this may be untrue in the strictest sense, but no one takes it seriously anyways. Everyone knows that this is just a commonly used phrase that has no real meaning besides being a phrase of politeness. So no one is really being tricked by this. No one will really think, oh, this person honors me very much, how nice. Well, when it comes to right, here Kant says, since it is just about the question whether we are fulfilling a law or not, whether our action has legality or not, and our attitude, our will, the ethos out of which we committed this action does not come into question, here there is only the letter of the law. And only the question, did we conform to the letter or not? Right, this is why in a state with the laws, there can be gaps in the law, or there can be legal gray areas, and the state cannot really do anything about it if you make use of that, right? Like, the judge cannot simply say, okay, technically, if we go by the literal letter of what the law says, you have not committed a crime. But what you have done clearly was something that the lawgiver did not intend you to do. When they wrote down the law, they didn't mean for you doing this action. So I will still say you are guilty. The judge cannot simply do that. The law may later be changed to close that gap, but as long as the gap is there, since it's all about the letter of the law, that is how it is, right? Kant does, however, also make the remark that the law, because it must be general, can never quite fit every single specific case. Like, there will always be cases that are different from the general rule, and so a law that may be just and right in general could still find a case where what we may call the sentiments of people of what is or isn't just will disagree with the law in this case. So, for example, I'm thinking, I have a friend who studied law, and they were given a case, which was a real case that happened in Germany, of a woman who for several years or maybe even decades had been raped and abused by her husband. and they had a daughter, and then when the daughter reached a certain age, I'm not sure, maybe she turned 10 or 12 or something, the husband said to his wife, tomorrow I will start to also rape our daughter. And at that point, when he was sleeping, she killed him. Like, she took some heavy object and killed him with that. And in German law, there are different types of killing a person, like not just in German law, also in many other laws, right? So there is like manslaughter, and there's also murder. And murder is also defined by an act that is planned in an insidious or treacherous manner. And in this specific case, since she had not just attacked her husband, say, with a knife openly, where he could have potentially defended himself, this was not just manslaughter, but by the legal definition, it would be murder, right? Because she planned it and she attacked him when he was sleeping, so when he was defenseless. So this would need to be punished more harshly. But of course, considering the circumstances of her long abuse and of her doing it to essentially protect her daughter, people would of course not feel that punishing her harshly as a murderer would be quite just. So this is the reason, Kant says, why the lawgiver should always keep an eye on legal practice, on what cases do come up and how judges deal with them, in order to see if there are gaps in the law, or if the law maybe doesn't fit all possible cases, and the laws should then sometimes be sort of rewritten and adjusted to, in the future, better fit all the possibilities. All of this means that ethics includes all of right, but on the one hand, it includes even more than that, even more duties, and on the other hand, even these duties of right, it includes, but in a different manner. And there's a parallelism here between practical philosophy and theoretical philosophy. There are often such parallelisms in Kant's system because of its architectonic, and Kant notes this. Because in his theoretical philosophy, in his theory of cognition, Kant says we have two different types of forms of viewing. I discussed this in my lecture on sensuality and on time and space as forms of viewing. Because space is the form of viewing of the outer sense. So the outer world, everything that happens outside of our consciousness, including our own body, and then also all other bodies in space, that we perceive in space. And then time is the form of viewing of our inner sense. So everything which happens inside of us, our thoughts, our feelings, and so on, we don't perceive as spatial, but we do perceive it as temporal. But here, the point is that whatever is outside, and therefore in space, when we do view it, it automatically is inside us now, right? We are conscious of it. What we view, our perceptions, is in our consciousness. And therefore, while not everything that is in time is in space, on the other hand, everything that is in space is also in time. Well, just like that, Kant says, as space is the form of viewing of the outer sense, So the right deals with our outer actions that we commit in the world towards other people, while ethics deals with our inner will, just like time is is the form of viewing of the inner sense. But just like what we view in space, we also automatically view inside of us, and therefore in time. These outer actions of ours that the right is concerned with are also at the same time a concern of ethics, because our inner will, of course, is connected to these outer actions. So therefore, right is included in ethics, but ethics includes more than that. On the other hand, however, right can also include more than the strictly ethical duties. Because to Kant, there are three types of right. And these three types he distinguishes according to the three categories of modality. So I already gave a previous lecture on Kant's table of categories, which you may check out to understand that better, because as I also explained in the previous lecture, the table of categories is really the key to Kant's philosophy and to the architectonic of his system. Because Kant says there are these 12 categories of our intellect, these 12 basic concepts of thinking, and all our thinking happens within these 12 concepts. So, therefore, all thoughts that are possible at all can be described and can be categorized by these table of concepts. And therefore, this must also be true, of course, for our thoughts about rights and about laws. And in the table of categories, there are these three categories of modality, which are possibility, existence, and necessity. And therefore, to Kant, there are also three types of right: possible right, actual, existing right, and necessary right. Let's start with the necessary right. This is the natural right, or natural law. Right here again, you have this translating issue. In German, you would say Naturrecht, and in Latin, you would say jus naturale. But in English, this is usually translated as not natural right or natural justice, but as natural law. But basically, what is meant by that in the philosophy of the 18th century, this was not just a thing in Kant's philosophy, this was something that more or less all the important philosophers of the time shared. By natural law, they understand a law that is supposed to not be given by the state. So it is not a human law that was put in place arbitrarily, but a law that we already that is already there by nature. So this is about rights that we have by nature. The state doesn't give them. The state just confirms that we have them. And this is exactly why these rights belong to the category of necessity. And these are precisely the rights that are also identical with our narrow duties towards others, right? So that we mustn't kill someone, that we mustn't rape, that we mustn't steal. All these, Kant says, are laws that reason itself gives. Not the state gives those, but reason. So even if there was no state, we would still have a duty to follow those laws. If we were virtuous people, if we were ethical, we would compel ourselves to follow those laws. And even if we were not, then other people would still have a right to compel us to follow them. And again, the state must conform with these natural laws. Like the state doesn't make it so that humans have a right to live. They already have a right to live before the state. And if the state says humans have a right to live, then what this really means is I, the state, confirm that they have this right and I will enforce this right. And a state that would be in conflict with natural law, that would give laws that go against natural laws, for example, that give laws that say that some people have no right to live, that some people may be killed, such a state would be an unjust state. Which leads me to the second type of right or of law, which is the positive right or the positive law. And of course, positive here does not mean, as it is often used now, does not mean something good, but it means something existing, something that is there, something given, right? Like when you are COVID positive, it's not a good thing. It means the illness is there in your body. So the positive law is the law that actually exists in a given state, right? The natural law is the law that is necessary because reason itself dictates that this should be law. The positive law is the law that is actually given in a state. And again, this must not necessarily be a good law. It could also be an unjust law, like the Nuremberg race laws, the Jim Crow laws, the apartheid laws in South Africa, the nation state law in Israel. All those clearly were or are apartheid laws. Clearly they are unjust. Clearly they are against the natural law. But they were at some point, or still are in the case of Israel, positive, that is existing law. And then thirdly, there is what Kant calls statutory right or statutory law. And this corresponds with the category of possibility. So these are rights or laws that are possible, that is, that a state could give, but the state doesn't have to give them. And these types of laws are not dictated by reason as such. Otherwise, it would be natural law. It would be necessary and not just possible. So they are, in a sense, arbitrary. That's also why Kant says, in the strictest sense of the word, there are no laws at all. Because to him, a law is something necessary, like the laws of nature or like the moral law of reason. What they are is they are commandments or decrees given by the state that could also not have been given. And such statutory laws, they do have their place in a state and they do have their justification. They are even needed often to properly enforce the necessary natural laws. Because, for example, let's take traffic laws, right? If we go with natural law, as reason dictates it, there would only really have to be one traffic law, and that is don't harm others in traffic. Like, for example, don't run over pedestrians with your car, or don't drive your car into other cars. And by mere reason alone, this could be the only traffic law. There didn't have to be a law that we must stand when the traffic light is red and we can drive when it's green. There didn't have to be a law that we drive on the right side or on the left side of the road. There didn't even have to be a law that we mustn't drive while drunk. Because in theory, abstractly, none of these things really go against anyone else's rights, right? By driving drunk as such, I'm not harming another person's rights. Only when I run somebody over with my car, then I harm his rights. But the problem is, of course, that if I do drive drunk, it becomes much more likely that I will run somebody over. And so, therefore, while reason as such does not necessarily dictate that we should not, that we should be forbidden to drive drunk, it is still very reasonable to forbid that for the state. So this is a good statutory law. But you can see that often these laws are arbitrary. Often there should be a law in place, but what the specific law is doesn't matter, right? Like, it is certainly rational to have traffic laws that say everyone must drive on the same side of the road, but whether we pick the right or the left side is kind of arbitrary. Likewise, it's a good thing to have traffic lights that tell people whether they can go or whether they should stand and wait. But it is kind of arbitrary to say that they must wait when the light is red and they can go when it's green. We could also make it so that it's the other way around, or we could pick completely different colors. And of course, this does not just go for traffic laws, but also for other kinds of laws, right? Like, consider the ownership of weapons, which in the US is, of course, something highly controversial. Again, the law of nature as such only says you mustn't kill or harm others. So by natural law as such, it would not be forbidden to own weapons or even to openly carry weapons, right? I mean, completely abstractly and hypothetically speaking, it could be possible for everyone to, anytime they step onto the street, walk around with a Kalashnikov in their hands, but still never to shoot anyone else. It could even be possible for every private citizen owning his own nuclear bomb that he keeps in his basement, but never using it. So no one's rights would be harmed. But of course, if people own weapons, it becomes much more likely that they will also use them, even if just by accident maybe, and harm others. So therefore, it is a very reasonable statutory law, and one that is in place in pretty much every civilized state, but not in the US, of course, that people should not own weapons. So these are the three types of laws. And again, these statutory laws, these laws that are possible but not necessary, they can be made positive law. The natural law, on the other hand, the law that is necessary, that must be made positive law. And the positive law should, of course, never include any laws that are morally and legally impossible. That is, laws that contradict the necessary natural laws. Kant says that anything that is created by the state is arbitrary, and therefore the state has the right to also destroy it again. And he says that specifically thinking of nobility, right? Because he says if we think of the state of nature, where there is no state, no government, no laws, everyone would be equal. Nobility can only exist within a legal framework that gives certain legal privileges to specific people based on their birth. And this was something that was being discussed, of course, in the late 18th century, especially in face of the French Revolution. Is it okay to take the privileges of the nobility away? Don't they have a right to these privileges that were given to them? And Kant says, well, since they were given, since they are not necessary privileges by nature, then yes, we can take them away. Of course, Kant was not the first to say so. I would say that maybe not with the same philosophical clarity, but at least as a sentiment. This was already said more than 200 years before, when at the start of the 16th century in Germany there were the peasant wars, big peasant uprisings, and one of the slogans of the peasants was als Adam grub und Eva spann, wo war da der Edelmann? Which can be translated as when Adam toiled and Eve span, where was then the nobleman? So, in other words, the peasants were already well aware that the nobility was not something natural, that humankind originally was equal, did not have nobility, and that it was only artificially created. And what is artificial may then again be taken away. On the other hand, Kant says, if something is mine already by nature, as is my very body, my life, my freedom, and I would have it even without the state, and could maybe at least potentially defend it even without the state, like in the state of nature, if there were no laws, sure, other people could attack me and take my life, but maybe I could also prevail and keep my life, then the state has no right to take it away. I will note that there's a parallel here between Kant's philosophy of right and his philosophy of religion, and it's not the only parallel. I will talk about more as I go on, because just like Kant makes a distinction between natural or rational law and statutory law, he also makes a distinction between rational religion and statutory religion. So Kant would say in religion too, there are certain parts, that is certain laws, certain commandments that are necessary, like you shall not kill. Even if there was no revelation, like in this case, if there had been no Moses and no 10 Commandments, even if no one told us this is what God wants from you, we could still know simply by thinking, simply by using our reason, that we shouldn't kill or that we shouldn't steal. But on the other hand, there are also commandments that we cannot know of a priori from our own reasons, but only a posteriori, by being told by some prophet, some revelation appearing, because these commandments are more like statutes. They are more like arbitrary decrees, like you must pray so and so many times, or you mustn't eat this or that food, or you must go on pilgrimage there. And Kant says these are not necessary commandments, but they are of course possible commandments. Like you cannot prove that God hasn't commanded you to pray so and so many times. So therefore, you may believe in them and you may follow these commandments. But the point is that the merely possible must never contradict the necessary. Because the opposite of the necessary is precisely the impossible, right? So therefore, Kant says in the state can enact some statutory laws, but they mustn't go against natural law. So there can be a traffic law saying you must drive on the right side, but there can of course not be a law that says that Jews have no right to live and must be killed. This would be an unjust state. And likewise, in religion, there can be commandments like you must pray 5 times a day, or you mustn't eat pork, or whatever. But there cannot be a commandment that says you shall kill all the infidels. Because here, since our reason alone, without needing any revelation, tells us that we mustn't kill anyone, that everyone has the same right to live and the same dignity, we know, even if a self-proclaimed prophet were to appear and to tell us that God wants us to kill someone, we know that such a commandment cannot possibly come from God. So if there was such a religion, it would certainly be a false religion. It would be some sort of paganism. And therefore, Kant would say that there is such a thing as rights or as religion that we can know from reason alone, and a specific state or a specific belief may expand on them, but they may not contradict them. What Kant also says about the statutory laws is that while they do have their place, and while they do have their justification and there's even a need for them, still there should be as little of them as possible. Because Kant says, as citizens, ideally we should be able to know what is and isn't a law, right? Because how can we possibly be expected to follow the law and to act within the law if we cannot know the law? Now, when it comes to natural law, this is not a problem, Kant says, because since it is a law that reason itself gives, you don't have to study law, you don't have to be a lawyer to know that this is law. You just have to think for yourself, right? Like to know that you shouldn't kill, or that you shouldn't break into somebody else's house and steal his stuff. You don't need to read the actual books of law in your state. You just need, many people would say this is just common sense, right? And it would certainly be a bad legal defense if you, let's say, murdered someone and then said, yeah, okay, I did kill him, but I still plead not guilty because I didn't know that killing was forbidden. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't study this stuff, so how could I have known? This would not be a good defense. But it is the not necessary but only possible laws that still are actual positive laws, so the statutory laws, which make it necessary for there to be legal experts who have actually studied this stuff. And since there are so many and so complicated such laws, this condemns us, Kant says, to a sort of civil tutelage, to not being able to fully think or judge for ourselves in civil manners, but to having to rely and depend on these legal experts. And this ideally shouldn't be. So the state should try to simplify and to reduce the number of laws if possible. And mind you, this is something that Kant said like almost 2.5 centuries ago, when there was way less laws and way less bureaucracy. So just imagine his shock and devastation if he could see the current state of affairs. Here I could end this lecture, because I've now explained the distinction between ethics and right, or law, or justice, whatever you want to translate it as. But I want to give an important note on that. And that is that Kant here has not thought things quite through and is not quite consistent, because he still considers the right, even though he does consider it to be different from ethics, he still does consider it to be part of the broader moral philosophy, the broader doctrine of duties. And this is a philosophical error. It was shown by Fichte very clearly that the right is a completely different part of philosophy, which is not a subcategory of morality, but completely disconnected from morality. And mind you, Fichte showed that his Rechtslehre, his doctrine of rights, even came out 1 year before Kant's Metaphysics of Morals. So Kant was very old at that point. It was some years before his death, and he didn't take note of it anymore. Kant here, I say, is inconsistent. He says that moral philosophy as a whole is the doctrine of duties, right? So not just ethics is about duties to him, but also right. So he does speak about duties of right. He says that, for example, not killing someone is not just an ethical duty, it is also a duty of right. But it is not. It is an ethical duty, of course, but if we consider only the area of right, then it is no duty at all. It is just something we are compelled to do, but for that very reason, it cannot be our duty. Because if you are doing something because it is your duty, simply because you should do it, then, as Kant himself says, you are again in the area of ethics and not in the area of rights. If you are doing something simply because you are forced to do it, because you are threatened with punishment, then you are not doing it out of duty. And this is, of course, the case if you are just following the laws of your state, not because you're a good person, but because you are made to follow them, right? So the right has nothing to do with duties at all. It has something to do with people's self-interest, and that self-interest being threatened by punishment, right? And Kant could have noticed this because he said that in the field of right, there is such a thing as a right of permission. So, right, or the law, permitting us to do things. But then Kant himself says at other points that morality knows of no permissions. In morality, there is only a commandment or a prohibition. So reason tells us either you should do this or you should not do this. you ought to do this action or you ought to refrain from this action. But it does never tell us you could do this action, you are free to choose this action, but you don't have to. That's what Kant himself says. So if then he says at another point that Recht does, in certain circumstances, tell us this action you don't have to do, but you can do, then he could have noted that this must mean that Recht is something of its own and not simply part of morality. And it is important for me to note this inconsistency in Kant's thinking here. This fact that he does distinguish the right from ethics, but he does not distinguish them fully, he does not fully separate them, because this leads to many further issues or contradictions or inconsistencies within Kant's thinking, within his legal thinking, his philosophy of right. And I think more or less all the issues you can find there, you can they come down to this basic issue of him not fully separating ethics from rights as he should. Still sticking, I mean, in many other parts of philosophy he went way beyond the philosophy of his time, but here more so than in other areas he was less critical, and he still kept many basic prejudices of the legal philosophy of his time, like this belief in a natural law. If you went with Fichte, you would say there is no such thing as natural law. If there is no state, then there is no rights, there is no law. There's of course still morality. You should still not harm other people and such. But if you do, it is not in that sense unjust. It is immoral, but not unjust, because there simply is no justice outside of the positive law that the state gives. Let me give examples of some of these inconsistencies or contradictions within Kant. So it is never quite clear, and he seems to somewhat self-contradict at some points, whether the right is completely identical with the ethical duties of towards others, the narrow ethical duties towards others, or if it is not. In ethics, Kant calls the narrow duties, so both of them, both towards others and towards myself, duties of right. He does make clear that the narrow duties towards myself, so the duties of right towards myself, are not part of the doctrine of rights, but just of ethics. But then even if you consider only the narrow duties towards others, sure, this does include stuff like don't kill, don't steal. That is also part of natural law. But then Kant also includes amongst the narrow ethical duties towards others such duties as don't be arrogant, or don't mock others, don't make fun of others. These are ethical duties towards others, and they are narrow ethical duties, but I think it's very clear that they are not legal duties towards others, that these are not things that the state can forbid as such. So it seems that the duties of right are not in their content identical with the narrow duties towards others, but are even narrower than them, only include some of them. But maybe the inconsistency is most glaring and could have been noted by Kant himself, where he deals with the plank of Carneades. This is a thought experiment that was already known in antiquity, which is about a shipwreck And there are two people who are now in the water trying to survive. And there's a plank of wood from the ship. And one person holds onto the plank to stay above water, and maybe with the plank he could be drifted to a nearby shore. But the plank is too small or too weak to hold both people. So when the other person tries to now hold onto the plank, the first person pushes him away, thereby essentially condemning him to drown, while he alone keeps the plank and survives. And the question is, in this thought experiment, is this okay? Is this morally okay? Is this legally okay? Should this be punished? Is this guy now a murderer? And this is a question, again, it has been known since antiquity. It sometimes gets discussed even today. Like, people who have studied law may have been confronted with that question. And Kant answers it correctly, I would say. But his answer only makes sense if we clearly separate ethics and rights. Because Kant says, doing this, pushing the other person away, condemning him to drown, is not right. You should not do this. But at the same time, he says it should not be punished. Like, if you now do drift to shore and you are found and somehow people find out what you have done, then you shouldn't be imprisoned as a murderer or something. Kant says, correctly so, that here there is no possibility of compulsion, right? And let's remember that he defined the whole field of right or of law by this possibility of compulsion. Like, normally a would-be murderer can compelled by the state, threatening him with prison or with maybe even the death penalty, to not murder. But here in this case, Kant asks, what would you want to threaten the guy with? If you threaten him with anything less than the death penalty, like with imprisonment, even life imprisonment, then he might still say, well, I would rather stay alive, even if in prison, than die. So I will still push the other guy off the plank, because for me that's the lesser of two evils. If you threaten him with the death penalty, well, then he cannot choose the lesser of two evils. He can just choose two equal evils. And in this case, it is likely that he will still push the other guy off the plank, because now he's choosing between certain death and possible death, right? Because if he doesn't hold on to the plank alone, then he will certainly drown. While if he pushes that other guy off and thereby essentially kills him, he only will possibly face the death sentence, right? Because maybe no one will find out, or maybe he will be able to run away and to hide, right? So still, there's nothing you can really threaten him with in that situation. And I think Kant is completely right with that. But the point is that he says you should not do this. You should not push the other person off. That is, it is immoral, but still you should not be punished for it. There is no possibility of compelling you here. The punishment would be pointless. That could have shown him, once again, that right cannot be subsumed under morality, but is something of its own. To say it with Fichte would say the philosophy of right has to basically answer just one simple question, and that is, how can several free beings that all have free choice, live alongside each other without taking each other's freedom away. And the laws should be such that they take away just as much freedom as is needed to preserve freedom. Right? So you can take people's freedom away to murder other people. You can prohibit murder so that no one gets murdered and everyone keeps his freedom. But beyond that, you should not take people's freedom away. Like, once again, you should not forbid people from engaging in premarital or in homosexual intercourse, even if you do believe they shouldn't do it, because then you would take more of their freedom than is necessary for everyone else to stay free. And therefore, since Fichte says the right is about answering the question, how can several free beings live alongside each other without taking each other's freedom away? He says this situation in the thought experiment of the plank of Carneades is a situation where there can be no right. It is a situation that happens outside of legality. Not outside of morality for Fichte. So Fichte would say, if you are a truly moral, a truly virtuous person, then you would rather sacrifice yourself. You would let go of the plank, give it to the other person, and give yourself in God's hands. Say, if it is God's will that I shall be saved, then another plank shall come my way. If not, then I would rather die with a clean conscience, not having survived by murdering somebody else, then keep my life, but with blood-stained hands. That is your moral obligation. That is how you would, so to speak, solve this problem if you were a fully virtuous person, Fichte says. But from a legal standpoint, he says, you are not committing an injustice. You are maybe committing an evil act, a sin, but not an injustice if you push that other guy off. Because again, a just state, a state where everyone has rights, is a state where several free beings can live alongside each other without taking each other's freedoms away. And here in this case, they simply can't. Right? There is no space for two free beings to live alongside each other. The plank only has space for one free being, so there is no space for rights. So, through his, I think, correct answer to the thought experiment, Kant could have noted that he must separate ethics more from right, but he didn't. And this, unfortunately, is a problem. I would consider Kant's philosophy of right, at least when it comes to the private right and the state right. The international right and the cosmopolitan right, they are great. But a lot of the private and the state right, I would consider to, along with Kant's theology, be amongst the weakest parts of his philosophy. It is the part that contains most errors, most inconsistencies, and the part that is least critical, least aufklärt. The part where Kant is the least ahead of other thinkers of the 18th century. Like, when it comes to other parts of his philosophy, his moral philosophy, his epistemology, his aesthetics, reading Kant and reading one of the people that lived at the same time as Kant, you could think they lived 100 years apart, because there's just such a big gap of philosophical depth and quality, but not so much often when it comes to his philosophy of right. Here you have that experience if you read Fichte. Even though Fichte's work came out 1 year before Kant, if you didn't know any better, reading both of them, you could think there has been 100 years of philosophical development between them. It's really staggering. But even so, I still want to spend the next weeks and months talking about Kant's philosophy of right. First off, because it is part of his philosophy, of the whole of his system, and it helps understanding Kant's thinking as a whole and understanding his whole system. And I don't want to gloss over the weaker parts or the wrong parts. I want to address them. But also, I don't want you to, from my words, get the expression that Kant's whole philosophy of right must be dismissed or is not worth being considered. There are still several quite interesting and quite valuable thoughts in it. And in particular, I want to say that Kant rightly identified the basic principles of what the right, what law, what justice should be about. I will address these further in the upcoming lectures, but I already want to mention them. And that is that, for one, Kant says all law is about what he calls the mine and yours. So, in other words, about property, right? Because our choice, our outward actions, they all affect things in this world. They all affect property, people's property, people's possessions. And this is essentially all that justice is concerned with. Determining what belongs to whom and making sure that everyone gets what belongs to him and that nobody takes what belongs to another. And then second, Kant would say that all rights, all law, have one basic task, and that is create perpetual peace. Kant, as I will discuss further, has three stages of right. He has the right on a national level, the state right or state law. He has the right on a level between nations, the international right or international law. And then he has the cosmopolitan right, which you could say is human rights as in general. But at each level, he says it is about creating peace. Justice and peace are essentially identical to Kant, because peace to him is more than a mere ceasefire, is more than a mere absence of fighting. A true peace is a state where there cannot be any further fighting. And Kant would say that all conflict, all war, is about the mine and yours. So is about what belongs to whom. It's about maybe two people or two nations fighting over the same object, the same resources, the same lands. And therefore, to create peace, we need true justice. We need a state where everyone gets allotted what truly should be his, and where everyone's property is then also protected from others taking it. So therefore, the whole philosophy of right is there to eventually create perpetual peace between people. I think these two principles, it is all about the mine and yours, and it is all about creating perpetual peace. These are very much correct, and this and what Kant has to say about this more specifically is certainly the best and the part of his philosophy of right that should be considered the most. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.